Hello, good morning everyone out there in webinar land. It's great that you can join us. My name is Chloy, I'm the Director of Insight here, and welcome to our final webinar for the Semester 2 2021 Insight APSAT webinar program. It's a new experiment today. We're doing our You Can Ask That Q&A session, and we've got a stellar panel of experts and commentators to guide us through the next hour of questions submitted by you. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered here in Meanjin on Turrbal and Yagala country, and to all the lands across the country where you might be joining us, and acknowledge traditional owners and elders past, present and emerging. Today is also a very special day. As you're probably aware, it's World AIDS Day, and the theme for the World AIDS Day this year is 40 years of HIV, where to next? And today aims to encourage Australians to educate themselves and others in relation to HIV and to reduce the transmission of HIV by promoting prevention strategies, ensure people living with HIV can participate fully in the community free from stigma and discrimination. It's also a day to support those living with HIV and to commemorate those who have died. So a very important regular date in our calendar, and the impact and the ongoing work of our sector and related sectors in addressing HIV and other bloodborne viruses. So as I mentioned, this is a new participatory experiment in our webinar offerings here at Insight, and we're going to give it a go and see if it works. Nothing like some live TV to make it interesting. And so what I'm going to do first is just pass it around our panel, who we have here live in our studio audience, and Sam online, just to introduce yourself, who you are, your job title, and perhaps what a regular day in the life of you looks like. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jeremy. Hi.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Jeremy Hayllar, I'm the clinical director, and I guess I split my time between seeing patients, both for opioid treatment and withdrawal management, and trying to kind of manage the service. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jeremy, for coming on again. Next, we have Chloe.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. My name's Chloe. I'm a Waka Waka and Cubby Cubby woman, and I'm here with the Insight team, and I'm the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Workforce Development Coordinator. New role recently started, and looking forward to helping to support our workforce who work with First Nations people across Queensland with drug and alcohol.
Excellent. Next on our panel, we have Sean.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Popovich. I'm the Director of Policy and Systems at the Queensland Network of Alcohol and Other Drug Agencies. We are the peak organisation representing non-government treatment services across Queensland. A day in the life of me looks like writing some policy submissions, potentially on behalf of the Queensland AOD Sector Network, leading the review of the treatment service delivery framework, and a range of other things. Also riding my motorcycles, which is nice and fun.
All high-risk activity.
My name is Cameron. I'm the team leader, social worker with Dovetail, Youth AOD Support and Advice Service. Day in the life of me is at Dovetail is dealing with lots of complicated questions that people phone us up with, much like today's format. So anything to do with weird drugs young people might be using, treatment approaches, ways we can help young people, complicated casework, that sort of thing. That's a day in our life. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Cameron. And online, we have Samantha Clark. Hello, Samantha.
Hi, Jeff. My name is Sam Clark. I am currently working within Metro South Addiction and Mental Health Services as a dual diagnosis coordinator. So a day in my life can be very different. It can be anything from training and education of staff, supporting staff to support clients who have complex mental health, alcohol and other drugs needs. A little bit of capability development, capacity development within the workforce, and sometimes some face-to-face work as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam. And just for those of you who might recognise Sam, she has a substantive position here. We look forward to her joining the Insight team later next year. So firstly, I'd like to thank the dozen or so people who submitted questions in advance. Most have been included. Some are similar, so have been amalgamated together. And some haven't quite fit the panel format. So hopefully we've been able to get most of your questions in. Of course, as the director, I retain the annoying right and ability to ask extra questions as I choose to see fit. Look, we're unsure if you do have a question online, and you're welcome to post it, but we may not be able to get to it because a lot of people have submitted questions already. I know some people already have. If you do, particularly if it's an extension or clarifying question, we might be able to ask it. But if it's a brand new question, we want to make sure the people who have submitted questions already get their question answered. But give it a go, but can't promise anything. And again, the joys of live TV, we'll just see how it goes. So what I'd like to do is throw to the first question, and there was a couple of questions related to this, and it is a topic that we're grappling as a sector, is how would you define lived experience in the world of alcohol and other drugs sector? And Sean, I might throw it over to you for the first one on this one.
Sure. Look, we did a piece of work recently looking, I guess, at getting people who use drugs to respond to what they thought lived experience was. And whether they identified as a peer in the I guess, substance using community. And what we found was even if people use substances, they often don't identify as a peer within that community. So there's other things to consider in that as well, which are often we talk about the lived experience workforce. But what does that workforce look like? In mental health settings, it's not illegal to experience a mental health issue, but for people who use drugs, particularly illicit drugs, unfortunately it is illegal. And so there are these things with the lived experience workforce that we need to consider to support how we might support that workforce to participate in that setting. What is actually defined as lived experience? Is it currently experience an alcohol and other drug issue? Is it someone who's experienced issues in the past but no longer experiences those issues? Or is it someone who's experienced the treatment system or someone who has perhaps not experienced any problems but just uses drugs? So there are a range of things to consider in terms of what lived experience is. The other thing that I'd add to that is the usefulness and the purposefulness of disclosure in an AOD sort of clinical setting. How do we use disclosure of our own experience with clients? Because it looks different in different population groups. For young people, disclosure might be more risky. For adults, perhaps less risky. So we need to consider those range of issues with what we term as lived experience in the AOD workforce. The last thing that I'll add, is that we do have a really high proportion of our workforce that identifies that they do have a lived experience, but perhaps don't feel safe enough to disclose it. So we've got an issue that we need to deal with there as well. How do we create safety for our workforce in recognising that actually, I have a lived experience of alcohol and other drugs problems or use or, that kind of thing. And how do we create safety for our workforce to do that?
Yeah. Certainly that recent NACEDA workforce survey revealed the high rates of lived experience among our workforce. Not all of it is disclosed. If we were to engage a lived experience workforce, you kind of mentioned some of this before, and I'll throw this open to anyone on the panel. What are some of the responsibilities of the workforce, of the organisations, the employers, to make sure that's a safe and secure, a safe experience for people who may wish to lead with their experience?
I can probably answer this one, Jeff, because Metro South does actually have a peer workforce in place. The peer roles have been embedded and integrated into service delivery in Metro South Addiction and Mental Health Services for more than 20 years. And we actually have the largest public peer workforce in Australia at the moment. The roles are predominantly in mental health. However, as we all know, alcohol and other drugs is usually part of a mental health presentation, and the peer workers who report to having a lived experience work across the two roles. We also have a couple of distinct roles. We have a living lived experience project coordinator who works across Brisbane South PHN and Metro South Addiction and Mental Health Services that looks to integrate the kind of the work between the two organisations to have a little bit of a better kind of working relationship. And we have two alcohol and drug service peer worker roles that are currently based within ladders, work in close contact with the social inclusion and recovery team at Metro South. Metro South also has they've recently developed a peer workforce orientation handbook to kind of help and guide people through that kind of role.
Excellent, Sam. Thank you for that. Cameron, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I'll add something. Just a little. One of the sort of concerns I have about the way we talk about this issue sometimes is that the act of substance consumption or even having a substance problem in itself doesn't say a huge amount. And actually that we know substance problems are not evenly distributed across the population. Drug laws are not evenly enforced across the population. And actually things like class and race and racism and culture are much more stronger determinants around how people experience drug problems than just the act of consumption. And so a really simplistic version of lived experience can actually erase class, race and poverty from the discussion. And I think that class, race and poverty are really super important when we think about what drug problems look like and what someone's actual lived experience, inverted commas, might be.
Back to the old social determinants, effectively. Yes. So that's a really difficult kind of place to straddle, because obviously services that do engage people with lived experience are generally considered to be more responsive, more flexible, more customised to what services need. So if we're looking at that spectrum of, I guess, consultation all the way through to probably employment, does anyone have any commentary about, you know, where services should start on this journey if they're thinking about it?
I think that, you know, as Sam just mentioned, we're already doing some really good work in the space. That should be acknowledged. I think the other thing that also needs to be acknowledged is that, particularly with our residential treatment providers that, you know, traditionally have come from the community as method sort of approach, where the people working in that community are from that community. So a lot of our residential services have been doing this for a really, really long time as well. So I think there's a lot to be learned from those types of approaches in how we engage people who've experienced the system to, you know, to help make the system better and support people.
Yeah. One of the questions that was submitted was, and I noticed there are no researchers on this panel, but should AD researchers begin disclosing on publications when they have lived experience of substance use? What are the benefits or downsides of this? Now, we don't want to talk on behalf of researchers when they're not represented on the panel, but is there any case where someone's substance use should be disclosed as a matter of ethical principle or not discuss? I wish to.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
That absolutely. I think that it comes back to the point that I raised earlier on is more about how do we create a safe enough environment for disclosure to happen. There's some really, really great work that Will Tregoning at Unharm is doing at the moment in presenting stories of people who use drugs that actually haven't experienced problems as well. And I think that you know, it's starting a community conversation about, well, what we know is absolutely that, you know, most people who use drugs don't experience problems. So as Cam was kind of pointing out, it's those other factors, the social and cultural and structural determinants of health that often are, you know, they implicate whether or not there will be a problem. And so I think we need to have a better conversation about, as you're saying, what lived experience is, what really leads to experiencing substance use problems itself. And I think once we start having that conversation more, it'll be safer for people and researchers to disclose their own substance issues as they produce that research.
So that's aspirational. That's where you hope we get to. Is it the case now?
No, it's not safe enough at the moment, would be my view. I think there's some courageous people who are doing it, and you know, hats off to them.
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh on this one before we move on to our next topic? No, let's move on. Thank you. It's a big one, and one that our sector is grappling with, and there's some great work happening across Queensland and the country. And we look forward to kind of aggregating that work to share as we all go down this journey. One of the questions submitted, and you'd have to know probably some of the works of Garba Mate, but is the source of all substance dependence emotional pain, as he posits? Sam, do you have an opinion on this one? You know the works of Garba Mate.
I And I recently watched the film that he released in June 2021, which was The Wisdom of Trauma, which may be where some of this question might have come from. I think it's probably, one of the things we maybe need to look at is what is emotional pain? How is that experienced by somebody? Emotional pain covers a vast amount of things, everything from kind of sadness and grief to kind of rage, shame, guilt, worthlessness. So it's a huge kind of area that one, statement can cover. Obviously, we are well aware that any kind of substance use can numb any of that emotional pain that's felt by somebody, and then overcoming that emotional pain is one of the most challenging aspects of recovery, because when you mask something with a substance use, it temporarily masks it, but it doesn't take away the unresolved feelings of that emotional pain that the person might have experienced. Also, pain can be, both a physical pain and an emotional pain. We have people who, for example, you might, stub your toe and trip over on something, and you feel that physical pain of the stubbed toe, but you may also feel the emotional pain of anger towards somebody who left that object there that you tripped over and stubbed your toe on. So we can have the two, both the emotional and the physical pain in that sentence, kind of both together. I don't think all substance dependence can all be related to emotional pain. However, there's numerous other kind of things that can lead people to have substance dependence. It can be initially just physical pain. It can be that people use substances for pleasure. It doesn't always have to be that it's an emotional pain. We do have, trauma-informed services now, where we kind of try to look holistically at the care of people to ensure that we do encompass that emotional pain as potentially one of the reasons why somebody began using substances. And I suppose reading this question led me to kind of reflect a little bit on maybe some of the therapy approaches that I've done some training in the past, and led me to think about EMDR. And one of the things that we do in EMDR therapy is, whilst you're going through the processing with somebody, is we'll ask somebody, where do you feel that in your body? So we're already looking for the physical response to the emotional trauma that somebody might have experienced. So there is that linkage between that emotional, that physical, and where somebody would feel it in their body. And only by going through that would we guide somebody through processing that kind of trauma.
Yes, MDR is fascinating in that regard, isn't it? Jeremy, I might throw to you. You work in opioid treatment, which is a pain treatment in many ways. Not always, but would you see within your patient or client cohort that all substance dependence has an emotional component?
I think that we have to be cautious about sweeping generalisations. So all is probably not the word I would use. Yeah. I would say many, and it's probably more than 50% of our patients have a history of trauma. I think Sam summarised the range of trauma / emotional pain very well, because it's a very broad spectrum. However, for many people, substance use begins as a way of trying to address that problem, to develop an altered state, and over time people get caught up with the substance itself and its dependence forming properties. So I think there's a lot to be said for that theory, but it doesn't explain everyone.
There's a bit of nodding happening around the room for well people listening. Yes. Anyone else want to add any comment to this around whether it's all emotional or?
Look, I know we've said substance dependence throughout, but what I often hear people talk about is just substance use itself, and that substance use, is related to trauma, and it's not use itself. It really is kind of problematic use that we're talking about often. So I just wanted to point that out. That let's be really, really clear about the different ways that people use substances. Some is, as Sam said, some is for pleasure, some is to deal with some, physical pain, some is to deal with emotional pain. So, but by and large, most people use drugs for pleasure.
Yep, the spectrum of use. Thank you, Sean. Let's move on to our next question. There was a question around young people's access to treatment, and Cam, I might throw this one to you. So what are the barriers to young people accessing treatment, and how do we overcome these? Just a simple question. So, yeah.
One of the barriers in Queensland is we don't have much of it. We've still got lots of, particularly regions in Queensland that don't have great access to youth drug and alcohol treatment. So we still that's improving, but we've still got a way to go on that. There's the similar barriers to adults in a lot of ways, but I think that we've still got. I think legal status is a huge problem, as it is with adults as well. Lots of young people are too scared to talk to adults about their problems because they think they're going to get in trouble for it. And I don't think that's that different with adults. I think with young people, they don't understand who all these services are. And I know I've spoken to workers who've had young people who just cannot believe they can talk to a Queensland Health staff member about drug use and that we don't call the cops. And that's a shocking revelation to lots of young people. So I think there's heaps of barriers around confidentiality in particular and being comfortable to talk to someone about it. There's always just a lot of hysteria around about drugs and young people as well. And it makes the conversation pretty clunky. There's a lot of moral panic around youth drug use a lot of the time. And so young people just see it as not relevant to their experience. And the conversation around drugs is just so different to young people's experience of it that they don't think adults have got much to offer. And in a lot of cases, it's actually true, because what they hear in school sometimes is exaggerated scare tactics and, people trying to scare them out of doing drugs, but they're actually having fun and they're not seeing those problems. And so it leads to this belief that, all of you adults out there don't really understand what we're doing. And so we've got a credibility gap as a service system in trying to, the way I approach it with actual young people and the way we talk to youth workers about it is acknowledging the credibility gap with young people and saying to them, you've probably heard a lot of stuff about drugs, it's not true, but there is some stuff you need to know about and let's talk. So there's some of the main, like in a practical sense, that's some of the way we try to overcome those barriers with young people.
Anyone else wish to chime in?
I think this is speaking as an aside from my role at QNADA, but in the past, I've worked with young people using drugs and just want to totally agree with what Cam said. Like there's that credibility gap with young people and, just again, reinforcing that issue that we need to have an honest conversation about substance use. And it's not just young people, it's with adults as well. I mean, the thing that I found myself reflecting on just then was the most recent AFP campaign around methamphetamine and I think it was other drugs as well. I only saw the methamphetamine one. And it's an old trope that we need to get rid of and it doesn't work. And it actually makes me angry when I see it because I go, actually, we're not helping people. We're just reinforcing stigma and making it more difficult for people to seek help when they need it. And that really is disappointing.
There was a little bit of a follow-on question about access to youth AOD rehabilitation in Queensland. Maybe that relates to this, what's the current rehabilitation options available for young people?
Do you mean residential rehabilitation?
It doesn't specify residential, but
because we've got, government has announced a new residential rehab for CANS targeting young people, which is in a lot of work going on at the moment around that. We don't have huge numbers. The argument against, the best thing about residential rehab for young people is it removes them from their environment and all the triggers around them. The worst thing about residential rehab for young people is it removes them from their environment and takes away all the triggers. So it's a double-edged sword in that they do well in rehab but learn no skills to apply in their real life. Having said that, some young people need to be removed from their environment. So it's complicated in that there are pros and cons to it. And that's, one of the reasons why it's not first line. It's definitely not something that we recommend first line for people. And there's not that much access anyway. So, they're the sort of pros and cons to resi rehab, which I think sometimes the public have a view that residential rehab is drug treatment. And there's a bit of a push in the system as well to put those young people somewhere where we can fix them and they come back to us fixed. And that's system needs, not young people's needs when some of that happens. And we do see some of that push coming from gaps in other parts of our system in housing and homelessness system and in youth justice system and in child protection system as well. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to a fairly
Very complicated area. Yes. Look, in the interest of time, thank you for tackling that one, and we'll move on to our next question. And this is around access for culturally secure practice. Are we on the, Chloe, this is to you, are we on the right track in implementing culturally secure practice in AOD in Queensland, in Australia?
Big question. Thanks, Jeff, and good morning to everyone as well. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're all meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And that extends to all places where this webinar is being viewed from. And I think in reflection of this question, I'd also like to just take the time to thank all the drug and alcohol workforce who are currently working or have worked with First Nations people in supporting their drug and alcohol and social and emotional wellbeing. So well done. I think having a question around cultural safety that we're asking about it, and that we is a really great indication that you know, we are on the right track. Perhaps we still have a lot more work to do, but the fact that we've given a forum to be able to reflect on this is certainly very positive. Cultural safety, if I can just say, is not a tangible item that we purchase or a fixture on the ceiling on the wall. It really is about the experiences and the feelings that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients feel when they're accessing our drug and alcohol support. So I would encourage us in all our viewers of the webinar, and not just today but ongoing, that you know, we're constantly reflecting inwardly and outwardly around our cultural competencies and our attributes that we all contribute in trying to improve cultural safety for our First Nations people. But cultural safety is not just about our individual sort of workers. It sort of flows into how our organisations are travelling, and then I guess also from a systems level point of view, and from what sort of springs in my mind, and there'd be probably great other people that can feed into this across the state, is the sort of profound and significant sort of work that co-designed with Quake that Queensland Health is doing around their health equity reform. And that's been the Health Legislation Amendment Act 2020 passed by Queensland Parliament, which is looking at institutional racism. So really great. And I think that supports the paradigm in which we're providing drug and alcohol services for our First Nations people. That's supporting not only our work, but the system we're working in. And sort of embedding that commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health equity with the Hospital and Health Boards Act 2011, it's requiring each hospital health service, HHS, to develop a plan in addressing this legislation. So very exciting stuff. And I think, you know, watching this space as it sort of in a strength-based way continues to grow and develop, it's holding hope for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think I just might ask Sean if you wanted to sort of feed in anything about the drug and alcohol treatment framework.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I totally agree with everything you just said as well. So thank you for that. In terms of the framework itself, we have been undertaking a review of the framework, as I mentioned earlier, and as part of that review, we've consulted broadly with the community controlled sector, as well as the Queensland Health Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group, and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about I guess what was missing from the framework, how we could better integrate that wisdom and knowledge from the community controlled sector into a broad mainstream monitoring framework. And I think now, dare I say, the framework much better represents, rather than, what was previously, I think what we would do is we would tack on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander section to the end of the framework. It's now integrated. The learning and wisdom is integrated into the framework. And I think that really reflects well on the way the system is travelling and how we're improving our understanding and of working together with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and community. But I think we've got a long way to go. You mentioned institutional racism, and I think it still absolutely exists. And we need to kind of review those structures that perpetuate those problems. And, the framework is a small part of that, but health equity is also a part of that. But there's definitely a long way to go and a long way to improve, close the gap as well. So, thank you for your comments.
We're certainly getting better at understanding and sort of, embedding trauma-informed, strength-based practices, and that's and understanding of what health means to an Aboriginal and a Torres Strait Islander person, and looking at it from a social and emotional wellbeing perspective. And how the integration between drug and alcohol and mental health services better work together to support wellbeing outcomes. But yeah, look, we could spend a really long time sort of talking about this, and like I said, that there'd be fantastic people across our state and Australia who could really feed into this rich conversation, and a conversation I hope continues to happen. But I also reflect that cultural safety is not just the burden is not just bestowed on us as Indigenous workers, but it is something for all of us to reflect on, and when I say reflect, I mean critically reflect, sort of inwards and outwards, and sort of how our everyday sort of attitudes and behaviours and continue to improve to support Aboriginal people. So I'm going to leave it on hope for the future, and this is all supporting healing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. And great that in Queensland we have our own dedicated Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Health Division with our own Deputy General and Chief Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Chief Officer, which is part of that systemic change that flows down through the system.
Fantastic leader leading this amendment. Hayllar Grogan and the team have done a fantastic job, and the consultation from across all our HHSs, but importantly, the fact that it's been co-designed with Quake, our peak body representing Aboriginal community-controlled health across Queensland. So it is the essence of it is just an example of what cultural safety is about. So it's great.
And I have to do a shout out to our colleague and friend, Eddie Fewings, who clocked up 10 years ago earlier this week working for Quake. Thanks, Eddie, if you're online. If not, or watching, thanks for all your hard work from Quake in this space. And
he was one of the rich voices I was thinking about.
I think a lot of people know Eddie. Also, Bevan Arkey, who's been a really strong support for the AOD sector in Queensland.
So cheers to our partners in Quake. Moving on to our next question, and it's a slight change of topic. I'm going to throw it over to you, Jeremy, about this one. There was questions around the use of urine drug screens within opioid treatment. What are your thoughts on it, and are there guidelines?
Thanks very much, Jeff. So because we've always done urine drug screens, shouldn't we continue? Is a pejorative and provocative question. No, I don't think it's necessary. I found a review from 2019 which looked for reported research to support the use of urine drug screens in opioid treatment to improve outcomes. And they looked at about 4,000 studies, reduced it down to 60, which were potentially relevant. And in the end, they only found one research paper, which really properly looked at this. And even that was quite limited in its conclusions. So I have to say that if we don't really have good evidence to support a practice, then we really have to question why we still do it. Now, we know that in the employment setting, urine drug screening is becoming quite widespread, particularly in the mining industry. And I think the considerations there are rather different. This is about workplace health and safety. In our own setting of opioid treatment, I think we really should be asking questions about patients or clients' function, how well they're doing, how well they're going. And I think the ritual of either regular or random urine drug testing, screening, has very little place in contemporary management. For the first point, it really undermines what we get from talking to patients, asking them how they're going and what substances, if any, they may have been using. And I think historically, perhaps there was less willingness on the part of patients to disclose substance use. And perhaps over time, that willingness has increased. So there is less need to check up on whether what the patient has told you is true. And if the patient tells you one thing and then you go on to do a urine drug screen, what does that say about your interaction with the patient and the trust and the relationship and the engagement? So I think potentially urine drug screens can even be harmful. Now, there may be occasions where they can be helpful. For example, if someone is behaving in a very strange and unusual way, then it may help explain things and to increase our understanding of what's going on and how we might intervene and support that patient. I know that one state that I won't mention used to require multiple urine drug test negative results before takeaways were allowed. And I think that's a really simplistic and unhelpful approach, which fortunately I think has now been discarded. So in broad terms, I think we should be talking to our patients, looking at how they're functioning in terms of work, education, family, relations, social well-being, rather than testing their urine. The urine gives a very small snapshot of the last 2 or 3 days, typically. When we find cannabis in the urine, what do? Do we ask people not to use cannabis? Do we ignore it? Are we really being honest in our approach? So I think there are many problems. We know that the urine drug screens may be inaccurate. We had a patient recently who tested positive for methamphetamine. She'd been using a lot of tapentadol, and it turns out that tapentadol can produce a false positive. So I think there are lots of problems. It costs money, and no one has shown that it contributes to good outcomes for patients. And that's where we should all be focusing. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. Anyone like to add to that position?
Just that I feel like I worry that it says, you're not to be trusted. And I think that it can be really damaging to the client relationship. And as Jeremy said, if there's not the evidence for it, then why are we doing it?
So, Jeremy, I'm going to go back to you for our next question, which was around how do we ensure that patients with a pre-existing substance dependence receive optimal pre- and post-operative or surgical management and care, especially including during an unplanned admission? So to our broader health system here
Well, I think we haven't really discussed the elephant in the room so far, which is stigma. And unfortunately, we all know from talking to patients that when the word methadone or buprenorphine or substance disorder is mentioned, the kind of barriers go up and people instantly make a negative judgment on their patient, regardless of the problem the patient may have. So I think having CL staff teams who kind of screen and capture patients prior to interventions, surgical, medical or otherwise, and advocate for them, and trying to break down the stigma in our colleagues is really important. How many times have we heard patients being told in emergency, well, you're on methadone, so you don't need any pain relief? I mean, fundamental errors such as that, it continues to astound me that that sort of belief is still held and shared with patients. Obviously, it's completely wrong. And we know from other studies that patients on a methadone treatment program often are more sensitive to added pain than others, not the emotional pain I'm talking about physical pain that they may have presented to emergency with, for example, a broken limb. So I really think we've got a lot of work to do. We need to inform our colleagues, get them to come and sit in the clinic and show that it's not all punitive and finger wagging. It's actually constructive and positive, looking to healthy, positive outcomes for patients. And perhaps by that means we can reduce stigma and recognise, help others recognise that this is just standard work.
Standard practice.
Thank you.
So yes, so stigma is the elephant in the room, or well, what's the biggest thing to eat in the room. Any comments about how we can challenge stigma within big health systems, particularly where unfortunately we think we're the part of this, the helping service that should be the least stigmatising, but unfortunately it's quite the opposite. How do we start to challenge some of those ingrained values and beliefs around stigma? I'm happy to throw this to anyone.
I'll have a chat about this.
Yeah.
I can say some things we shouldn't do because I think there's a tendency to rush to really oversimplistic responses to this problem. And I've seen this happen before that, things like we can offer, destigmatizing training, but then the only people who do that are the ones who don't need to do it because they generally are interested in it. There's also things like campaign-like things like advertising and promotional posters and such. And I'm not convinced that that's particularly useful either. So I think we should be very careful we don't rush to tokenistic sort of approaches to address what is really quite not limited to the health system. These are stigmatising views that exist across the entire community and are just reflected in the health system is often where we see it. So it's actually a much broader issue. The big underlying, one of the big major structural factors is the prohibition of illegal drugs, because the prohibition of illegal drugs almost does give a green light to stigmatise people, and that is extremely stigmatising in itself, that you can be arrested for having the problem that you've got. So I think that's one of the big ones. We still, unfortunately, in the youth arena, have significant problems with dual diagnosis and the old language and the so-called young people falling through the gaps. We continually receive large numbers of reports of young people who are refused access to mental health treatment because they are using drugs, and that they are defined to not have a mental health problem. They have a behavioural problem or a drug problem, whatever. And so I know that in the adult system, there's been a lot of work to fix that. And I think there has been a lot of progress. Unfortunately, in the youth arena, that is definitely not the case. And I think in the youth arena, we've still got a long way to go in addressing the, no wrong door. Well, I can't see a right door sometimes because people get booted for using drugs and can't get access to a health service because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add, although there has been work in the adult system, there's still, still the same problems. I think substance use and particularly problematic substance use, it's very heavily stigmatised, of course. Decriminalisation would be a start.
Well, that is the next question
what a coincidence.
What a coincidence. These questions happen to slide up. One of the questions submitted is, should drugs be decriminalised and or legalised? And what's the difference? Who'd like to have a crack at this one?
I'll start. Good question, because we need to be clear about the differences between decriminalisation, legalisation and commercialisation. I think when people are asked about decriminalisation, they get confused and they're like, well, they see similar things to alcohol advertising in sport, which we all agree is no good. And actually, decriminalisation is the removal of criminal penalties for personal possession and use of drugs. That's a very simple way of describing decriminalisation. There are multiple levels of legal regulation that can happen as well, and it doesn't necessarily involve the commercialisation of the substance, so that kind of advertising. And so when we're having this conversation, I think we need to be clear on that first, and then I would answer your question by saying absolutely we need to decriminalise all drugs. And the Queensland Productivity Commission, in fact, released a report in 2019 coming to that very conclusion. The report, for anyone who's interested, is called The Inquiry into Imprisonment and Recidivism. It's an excellent report. I think on page 500 and something, there's the whole cost benefit analysis of the substance use issue. But they basically recommended decriminalisation of all drugs and exploring legal regulation of cannabis and MDMA. And I think that says a lot for where we're at and what the evidence suggests we should be doing and what we're currently doing, which we know doesn't work. And we've got years of evidence, and the most famous I guess example of that is Portugal, which I believe decriminalised all drugs in around 2001. So
But won't that just open the gate, and all these people who have thought about using drugs that never did because they were too scared would just race out and start consuming and getting into trouble?
no.
It's clear that that didn't happen in Portugal, and I think we can rest our case based on the fact that overdose deaths and HIV actually fell in Portugal compared with other European countries over the last 20 years. And with Ivan Vrkovic, the mental health commissioner, we went to visit Portugal, went to Lisbon, and actually saw firsthand the results of this really imaginative and brave step that they took. And some other countries are slowly falling into place, and really the home of the war on drugs, the US, is progressively legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis. So there are major moves afoot. One publication that sticks in my mind drew a U-shaped curve for where the harms from drugs lie. One end of the U is where it's heavily criminalized. The other end is what Sean was talking to, where the advertising is gone wild. Now, in the middle, at the lowest point of this curve, the least harm is really where it's decriminalized, and supply is controlled. So we have to protect people under 18 or under 21, depending on your taste, and also protect people with mental health disorders, for whom most substance use is going to worsen their condition. On the whole, though, trying to interfere with what adults with capacity do in their spare time is not really reasonable if they're not causing harm to others. So I think we should take that kind of broad philosophical principle and apply it in the field of substances. And that will go a long way to reducing stigma and the other issues which we've discussed earlier.
Yeah. Other commentators, Sam or Cam, do you want to add anything?
Jeremy.
Sorry, I was on mute there for a second. You know, Jeremy and obviously Ivan and the team that went to Portugal had the great kind of first-hand insights as to what decriminalisation can do. And there's, it's 20 years now since that happened, or more than 20 years. And there's plenty of research papers that say that approach has been very beneficial. But it was it's also the fact that they moved the funds that they used to, fight the war on drugs, for a better use of words. They then moved that into treatment, so they invested that in, ensuring that people, gained employment, gained connections, became, socially included, which is all part of when you holistically look at the needs of a person, that where we should be working towards to, ensure that we look at the person as a whole, their needs as a whole, and not just kind of go, well, you've committed something criminal, here's now a criminal sentence that is going to exclude you from, certain places of work, certain travel, etc. You've stamped that person, for the rest of their lives. Whereas really, if we look at Portugal and how they changed that around to become inclusive, and look at supporting people, it's had great kind of, great success.
Mm. So Sam, just to continue on, why, in your opinion, are some drugs illegal and other drugs legal when it doesn't necessarily seem to relate to the impact of harm or the level of harm they cause?
It certainly doesn't, especially when you look at alcohol. Alcohol causes the greatest amount of harm to the person and the greatest amount of harm to society, yet, it's legal for people over the age of 18. And it's not one study that's proved that. There were, David Nutt completed that study in the UK, and then it was repeated by Yvonne Bonamore in Australia. So we know that, you know, sometimes it's our legal substances that actually create the most harms in terms of, you know, impact to society, chronic disease, loss of productivity. But the stigma is more on those illicit substances as causing the problems. You know, I do think it is something that, you know, we do need to look at. There are, for a lot of the substances that are around and deemed as being illegal, there is actually, you know, positives to be gained from some of those substances. We've seen, you know, trials for MDMA with PTSD. We've seen ketamine in depression, all showing really, really good results. You know, it should be something that we should be looking at, decriminalising more substances rather than criminalising people who use substances.
Cam or Sean, do you want to add to?
I can add something to that. I think the global prohibition has really racist origins, because really what occurred under the single convention was the criminalising of drugs of the so-called developing world, so cannabinoids, opioids and hallucinogens, and then commercialising and marketing the drugs of the developed world, which is pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and then tobacco being the only one that slipped through. But it slipped through because it was businessised and commodified really quickly. So their origins are just actually racist. And Queensland's first drug laws targeted Aboriginal people and their use of opium. And then Immigration Act federally restricted Chinese people smoking opium, allowing opium to be available to everybody else. I mean, that's just one example, but really ultimately it's historically just racist in the origins. And we're still, once the commercial interests of the organised crime have got involved in that, that's now become very complicated to disentangle, because that organised crime that runs the global drug market are not just going to pack up and go away. And I think that's one of my criticisms of just decriminalising, is it allows the organised crime to remain, and that there are harms in our society caused by the profits generated by illegal drugs. And so actually we have to be focused on helping the end user, but also removing the profit from the massive organised crime industry that runs the whole show, because that industry will diversify into other illegal markets, which will have other ranges of harms in our society. And so we've got to take the profit out of that. And that's why I think decriminalising, while it is a good first step, doesn't get us to that point of actually dismantling the giant illegal market out there.
Yeah. So you heard it here first, free drugs for all, says Cameron.
That was not what I said. Thank you for paraphrasing.
So a health issue, not a law and order issue. I think that's fundamentally what drove the Portugal experiment, which is now no longer an experiment.
Yes, after 20 years, you can't say that's a part, can you? I will keep moving along because of, in the interest of time. So we all know that, you know, the 90s and prior was the decade of heroin and depressants, and in early 2000 there was a rapid switch to the emergence of methamphetamine, which has pretty much remained the kind of the primary driving substance trend in Australia and lots of the world since. Where do you see this pattern continuing, or do you see it changing? So what substance trends do you predict in the next 10 years? Do you want to start with this one, Jeremy?
Well, I think the chemists are hard at work building new substances, to get round drug laws, which are struggling to catch up, though Queensland sort of cheated, saying that any substance intended to have this result is illegal from here on. So I guess there will be more of that happening, and we know the Europeans, EMCA, they publish each year the number of novel novel compounds discovered, and it's in the hundreds each year. So I think there'll be more of those coming along fundamentally. But we all know cannabis and tobacco and alcohol and opioids, they're here to stay.
Chloe or Sean or...
I think that the reason why these novel substances keep popping up is because we don't have any regulated market for for the traditional existing drugs. Given the choice, people will take the thing or use the thing that is they deem to be the safest for them, put in place strategies to reduce harm. So it's mind-boggling to me that, of course, we can't keep up with the novel psychoactives, but we're not putting in place those kind of CAMs touched on, things to regulate that traditional market where we could actually keep people safer. And it raises the issue of drug checking as well, and the importance of drug checking services, because given the right information, people will make decisions to keep themselves safer. That's been shown time and time again. So I think that we've got a long way to go with addressing our kind of moral inclination versus what the evidence says as a society.
Yeah, I think also the iron law of prohibition, the Productivity Commission report describes the so-called iron law of prohibition, which is whereby under prohibition there is incentives in the market for drugs to move from less potent to more potent forms. And with cannabis, we've seen it from the 70s, low purity cannabis to high purity skunk to synthetic cannabinoids. We get plant-based opium to heroin to fentanyl. We've gone from ephedra, natural stimulant, to amphetamine sulfate to crystal methamphetamine. So all the drugs under prohibition tend to push towards more pure forms because it just makes economic sense. We're now going through we have been moving through a low purity MDMA to crystal MDMA, same sort of pattern that's been occurring. So I think, as Sean sort of pointed out, the prohibition creates the incentive for drugs to move in that direction. It happened under prohibition of alcohol with moonshine. And so I think that we have to stop the cycle of incentivizing these super potent, more and more dangerous drugs and take the heat out of it and look at what are the drugs with the lower risk of harm, and is there a regulatory environment that can make those available to the community while minimising the impacts of that on people's health and welfare.
Yeah. Sam, anything to add to that? Or
I just totally agree with what Cam's just said. We've even seen that in the prescription medications like the benzodiazepines, that the forms in which they've been available will change. And I suppose that was the only thing that I was thinking as Cam was speaking, was that often it's not only does the drug become purer, but the form in which the drug is taken changes as well. So we've seen, the emergence of designer benzodiazepines, which is now, benzodiazepines on blotter paper, which was something I don't think any of us would have thought up in a million years. But I think it's more that there is also the development of different routes or different forms for how people will take the same substances.
Yes, and there were a couple of questions about benzos that came through, but we didn't have time to get to them because it's another big topic in itself. I've got two last really, really quick questions. So quick comments from people. The AOD workforce is an ageing workforce, except for these young chickens on this panel today. What strategies would support recruitment and retention into the sector? How do we encourage and retain the next wave of AOD workers in Queensland and Australia?
I'll keep it brief.
Yeah.
I think that we need to make working with people who use drugs, for want of a better word, it's the only one that's coming to my head, make it sexy. And I think that, sorry about that.
Sex and drugs do go together.
Yeah, we do though, and honestly, stigma reduction is a big part of it. But we also need to kind of make sure that in our universities that are delivering allied health and other health courses, that they're teaching about substance use. And I know I did my undergrad in psychology, and I learned next to nothing about substance use in my undergrad, and that's really disappointing. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of the workforce and getting people interested in the space. I would say that we're probably the coolest workforce that you come across. So
sexual health workforce, beg to differ.
Yeah. If there's anyone out there listening today that wants to be a part of the AOD workforce, please sign up.
Yeah. Sure.
I think just to add to what Sean said, Dana did a state of the workforce report on alcohol and other drugs nurses, and they found exactly what Sean said. We're older. Nurses in general are older, but the rate at which the kind of over 65 age group of AOD nurses sit-in is has doubled since 2013. So that means there's a lot of experienced nurses in the alcohol and drugs field who are moving into that older age bracket towards retirement, which will give us a loss of that skill set. And just to echo what Sean said, I also, in my training as a nurse, received no AOD training whatsoever. And one of Dana's major recommendations from their report was that AOD and AOD nursing becomes an integral part of contemporary undergraduate nursing training.
It seems funny that such a ubiquitous behaviour across the population receives such little attention in the formal curriculums across all matters of health. I've heard this reflected in medical training as well, but alcohol and drug is very, very minimal. Any other comments on that one before we go to the final question? Can't work for us, we're fun. This is one for each of you. So I'm going to go around each of you individually. What is your biggest single learning from working with clients who have substance use problems or substance use disorders? What have they taught you the most? Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, I think every patient's got their story, and it's incumbent on us to hear that story and try and understand it, and if you like, walk in their shoes, and that will aid their recovery. So that's the lesson I've got. There's always hope, and if you can taper your approach to the individual's needs and experience, then you give them the best chance of success.
Thank you, Jeremy. Chloe.
It's just, that was the first, that was my first thing that came to my mind.
Sorry, we didn't talk about
No. Yeah, just the stories and the connection you have. It's an honour working with and supporting clients with drug and alcohol, drug and alcohol problems. And I think, Jeremy really summarised that really well. And if I could just add to that, it's kindness and that everyone's human, and that we all have human needs, and it's about being supportive and how our services acknowledge this and work around it to get the best outcomes.
Sure.
I guess just extending on some of that, don't assume, be genuine in what you know and what you don't know, because people that we work with, particularly young people, will call bullshit. And they'll tell you, sorry, I don't know if I can say that on telly. That's the reality. They will know that you're trying to fake it. And so, being genuine in your approach, words like non-judgmental and all that are catchy, but you really need to understand what you bring to the interaction, what your personal values and beliefs are and your prejudices, so that you can be genuine in your interactions with clients. So,
thank you. Cameron.
For me, it's probably just the amazing capacity of people to overcome terrible situations that on the outside, even on your first encounter, you're doing an assessment with someone and you're quietly thinking to yourself, whoa, this is really intense, like this person's got some massive challenges, and they totally pull it off. Yeah. It's amazing to see that. And the cases I've been involved in, those most spectacular ones, have felt like I did the least, had the least contribution towards it. That it was often, I was like a bystander to people working it out themselves and getting it together in amazing ways that I think, particularly when I was probably new to it, I don't think I appreciated how much people actually could get it together with fairly minimal support from me as a worker, that we don't perform miracles. Our clients do, actually. Yeah.
We're in a meeting, you should be working harder. What about you?
I think for me, the biggest learns I've had is, just building kind of genuine connections with people, listening to them, their story, and acknowledging them as the expert in the person who's guiding their own care and treatment.
Yeah. Excellent. And on that note, we'll draw the panel to a close. Please join me virtually in thanking Jeremy, Chloe, Sean, Cam and Sam for sharing their insights and their wisdom and their ideas. Look, and we had 100 people at the highest point tuning in today, suggesting that there is a bit of interest in live TV. So this might be something we do again same time next year. There's a few people to thank. I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank James Hoey and Tracy for organising this and preparing all the questions and the format for today. Ben and Niall, not just for today, but for your ongoing tech support for the webinar program all year long. I couldn't do it without you behind the scenes and making it go so seamlessly. A quick shout out to Jim Hunt, who pulled together the webinar calendar this year for an amazing job and for handing the baton over to us. Thanks, Jim, if you're tuned in. I'd like to thank our partners APSAD as well for the webinar calendar each semester, and the ABC for allowing us to rip off their show in creating the name for the webinar. Thank you for that. Sorry we didn't ask your permission first. That's it for us for the year. On behalf of Insight, I'd like to wish you all a very safe holiday season and a time away. We hope you have a good time with family and friends. And we look forward to seeing you back for another amazing webinar program beginning in, I think, early March or late February, probably early March in 2022. So thanks again. Have a great break and we look forward to seeing you in 2022. Goodbye.